Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have James Baldwin, author of Sonny's Blues and If Beale Street Could Talk, versus Norman Mailer, author of The Naked and the Dead and The Executioner's Song. This one ends with the two squaring off on the cusp of a fistfight, which is an incident relayed to us by, of all people, James Patterson. So we have three authors who have all separately appeared on these diss tracks converging. Folks, the literary world is just messy. So Mailer and Baldwin first meet in Paris in 1956. At this time, James Baldwin is 32, Norman Mailer is 33. The two very much admire each other upon first meeting. Mailer would later reflect, quote, "I don't think there was anyone in the literary world who was more beloved than Jimmy." This mutual affection begins to come to an end in 1957 with the publication of Norman Mailer's essay, The White Negro. To put it pretty broadly, in this essay, Mailer argues that post-World War II, following the horrors of the Holocaust and the dropping of the atomic bomb, that these things induce a kind of grand and suffocating existentialism, emphasizing the tenuousness of individual existence. To which Mailer argues there are two responses to this sort of existentialism. In one, you conform to the violence of existence and thus become what he calls a square, or you embrace existentialism in patterns of rebelliousness and sexual freedom, even violence, thus becoming what he affectionately refers to as a hipster. Now, the image of the hipster provided by Mailer is very much a description of the beatnik, folks like Jack Kerouac or Allen Ginsberg, although Ginsberg would disapprove of Mailer's essay. Because while Mailer's argument may seem somewhat anodyne from my description, the leap in logic that he makes is to say that the hipster is the titular white Negro. Mailer argues that the, quote, Negro had been experiencing this kind of existentialism that's just recently present to white folks. He writes, quote, "Knowing in the cells of his existence that life was war, nothing but war, the Negro, all exceptions admitted, could rarely afford the sophisticated inhibitions of civilization, and so he kept for his survival the art of the primitive. He lived in the enormous present, he subsisted for his Saturday night kicks, relinquishing the pleasures of the mind for the more obligatory pleasures of the body. And in his music he gave voice to the character and quality of his existence, to his rage and the infinite variations of joy, lust, languor, growl, cramp, pinch, scream, and despair of his orgasm. For jazz is orgasm. It is the music of orgasm, good orgasm and bad, and so spoke across a nation." So here, Mailer is playing directly into stereotypes of black sexuality, particularly the hypersexuality of black men, something that Mailer seemed to be somewhat obsessed with, which would garner a lot of criticism, including from James Baldwin. But James Baldwin doesn't respond initially. He is provoked to do so by Mailer taking a jab at Baldwin in Mailer's work, Advertisements for Myself, a work that is quite literally an advertisement for Mailer that includes him taking shots at pretty much every other notable writer at the time. Of Baldwin, who is a queer writer, by the way, Mailer's critiques are drenched in like a tone of homophobia and just belittlement. Mailer writes, quote, "James Baldwin is too charming a writer to be major. Even the best of his paragraphs are sprayed with perfume. Baldwin seems incapable of saying F you to the reader. One itches at times to take a hammer to his detachment, smash the perfumed dome of his ego, and reduce him to what must be one of the most tortured and magical nerves of our time. If he ever climbs a mountain and really tells it, we will have a testament, and not a noble toilet water. Until then, he is doomed to be minor." That is more than enough to awaken James Baldwin. So in 1961, Baldwin writes an essay for Esquire entitled "The Black Boy Looks at the White Boy," which takes aims at Mailer's White Negro essay. Baldwin writes, quote, "But why should it be necessary to borrow the depression language of deprived Negroes, which eventually evolved into jive and bop talk, in order to justify such a grim system of delusions? Why malign the sorely menaced sexuality of Negroes in order to justify the white man's own sexual panic?" And on his relationship with Norman Mailer, Baldwin continues, quote, "The great gap between Norman's state and my own had a terrible effect on our relationship, for it inevitably connected, not to say collided, with that myth of sexuality of Negroes which Norman, like so many others, refuses to give up. The sexual battleground, if I may call it that." Years later, in 1984, Baldwin is giving an interview and is asked to remark upon Norman Mailer. Baldwin very tactfully suggests that Mailer's persona has overwhelmed his writing, arguing that the public perception that Norman Mailer has created has in turn become his own sort of core reality. When pressed further, Baldwin says, quote, "Why should I talk about Norman? I'm very fond of him and have great respect for his gifts." Well, perhaps he's a perfect example of what it means to be a white writer in this century, a white American writer in this country. It affords too many opportunities to avoid reality. And I know much more about Norman than I'm willing to say in print. After all, I care about him. But it ain't over yet. In his memoir, James Patterson recounts his very first New York literary party, one where a commotion broke out. Patterson describes it as, quote, "In the middle of the room stood these two small men. They were arguing loudly, fists clenched, looking like they were ready to rumble. The bedroom had become a pint-sized boxing ring. The men were Norman Mailer and James Baldwin, two little guys who looked about as athletic as French poodles, especially Baldwin. I remembered that Mailer had actually done some prize fighting, but he didn't look like much of a fighter to me. The two men were squared off at center ring. Mailer and Baldwin were arguing about what should be considered good literature and what shouldn't. It seemed clear they weren't big fans of one another. Weird, because I was a fan of both of them, especially James Baldwin. It set the tone for the absurdity of literary warfare, which I've tried my best to avoid."
You sure about that? You sure about that?
So folks, who do you got in this fight? Norman Mailer or James Baldwin?